Hi everyone, this is the ECON315 guided study group session, and today we're going over the lesson 6 extra practice problems. Today there's 3 problems. The first one is more algebraic and uses some graphs, and then the last 2 are just conceptual questions that don't have a lot of explanation. So this session will be really fast, but hopefully it's pretty straightforward enough that you'll be able to understand it by the time you're done watching. So I'm gonna get started with number 1. So compensating differentials. Assume the demand for teachers, labor demand in a school is given by the following equation. W equals 1700 minus 2 labor demand, and the supply of teachers, LS, depends on whether the school is a public school or a private school. So they give us labor demand, and they give us the labor supply equations for each school. So number 1 says, what is the equilibrium weekly wage and quantity of teachers in each school? We've done this plenty of times by now, that this should be super fast, but I won't go super fast. So like always, I'm gonna write out what they give us. So W equals 1700 minus 2L. I'll just put a D subscript. And then for public schools, the labor supply equation is W equals 4LS plus 800. And for the private schools, it's W equals 4LS plus 500. So in solving equilibrium wage and level of employment, all we need to do is set them equal to each other. Now in this case, the equations supplied today have W isolated. In the past, we've seen the labor variable isolated, but just for future reference, as long as both your supply and demand equations have the same variable isolated, you can set them equal to each other. So since both these equations have W isolated, it's okay to solve for L and then solve for W, versus what we've done in the past where we've solved for W and then L. So hopefully that made sense, but I'm going to solve, I'll put public as 1 and private as 2. So for 1, we can just set our demand equation equal to our supply equation. So subtracting 800 from both sides, we get 900 on the left. And then adding 2L to both sides, we get 6L on the right. And then dividing each side by 6, we get an equilibrium level of employment of 150. In this case, we can plug this back into any 2 of the equations that we set equal to each other. You can't plug it back into the private school equation. So I'm going to use the supply equation. So W would equal 4 times 150 plus 800. And then that gives us a wage equal to 1,400. So like I said, the variables were set up differently today, but we're still able to solve for the equilibrium values. So that was for the public school system. Now we can look at the private school system and set it up the same way. So we're using the same demand equation, but this time we're using the private school supply equation. So it's going to be 4LS plus 500. So then solving for this, we can subtract 500 from both sides to get 1,200 on the left. And then adding 2L to both sides, we get 6L on the right. And then dividing each side by 6L, we get equilibrium level of employment equal to 200. And as always, we can plug that back into either equation. that we've used to solve for the first one. So I'm going to use the labor supply equation again, but this time for private school teachers. So it'd be 4 times 200 plus 500. So this gives us an equilibrium wage of 1,300. So as we can see, we've solved for the equilibrium values in each school system. So then the second question says, what is the pay difference between the two schools? So this can easily be taken by finding the difference between the equilibrium wages. So this is going to be, this whole thing was number 1. And then I'm going to put number 2 up here. So the pay difference would just be 1,400 minus 1,300, which equals $100. And that's all that was needed for that one. So then number 3 says, if this was a perfectly competitive market, what should happen to the quantity and wage of private school teachers? So what we can do is look at, I think the easiest way to analyze this is setting up a graph. So this will be for private school. So this is a tiny little graph, but I don't want to erase the stuff I've already written. So we have our wage, labor, supply, demand. So we have our equilibrium values. So in the private school system, we can see that the wages are lower than the public school system. So what we should expect is, because teachers want higher wages, they're going to switch over to the public school system. So this is going to shift the supply curve to the left, since there's going to be less teachers supplying their labor in the private school section. This is going to shift the supply curve to the left or upwards. And then looking at the price, the new wage and quantity, we just have to look at where the new equilibrium wage is relative to where it was for this school system. So we can see that the new wage has increased and labor has gone down. So hopefully that was pretty straightforward to follow. The wages are higher in the public school system, so more teachers are going to leave the private sector and go to the public sector. This is going to decrease the supply of private school teachers, shifting the supply curve to the left. And then from this shift, we can see that the equilibrium wage goes up and the equilibrium level of employment goes down. And we can look at the same analysis for public school teachers, what we should expect to happen. So in the public school system, we can see that this shift from this change of teachers moving from private to public schools is going to increase the supply in the public school sector. So increasing the supply of teachers in the public school sector is going to increase their supply curve and shift it to the right. So from this increase in supply of teachers, the curve shifts, and we can see from this analysis that the equilibrium wage goes down, but labor goes up. Apologize, these graphs are kind of tight, but hopefully you're still able to read them. But again, we can see in the first part, in number 3, that from the wages being higher in the public school sector, private school teachers are going to leave private schools to take advantage of the higher wages in the public schools, therefore decreasing their supply of labor, which for the private sector would increase wages and decrease labor. But then those teachers that move over to the public sector is going to increase the supply of public school teachers, and from the increase of teachers in the public sector, wages are going to go down and labor is going to increase. So like I said, I think the easiest way to answer these two questions were by looking at graphs, but you can definitely solve it without graphs, or answer it without graphs also. But that is all of that one. So then moving to number 2, overtime pay. These last two, like I said, are more conceptual, so really you just have to follow the answer given on Canvas. There's not much more I can say, but I'll still go over it. So it says, some employers offer jobs for which overtime is mandatory. Others offer jobs for which overtime hours are usually available to workers if they wish to work them. Still, other employers offer jobs for which overtime hours are not commonly worked. By law, overtime pay for hourly workers is 50% greater than regular pay. Suppose that a careful study of wages finds that all else equal, jobs for which overtime hours are commonly available pay lower wages than jobs for which overtime is not usually worked. The term wage refers to the normal wage, not the overtime wage. Furthermore, the study finds that jobs for which overtime is not usually worked pay less than jobs in which overtime is mandatory. So what do the results of this study tell us about worker attitudes regarding overtime? So the answer given is that workers enjoy jobs where overtime is available the most because they pay lower wages, which we can see in the prompt. Jobs for which overtime hours are commonly available pay lower wages. So workers enjoy those jobs because of lower wages. And then they find jobs requiring mandatory overtime the least desirable because they're paid the highest, which they say in the last sentence. The study finds that jobs for which overtime is not usually worked pay less than jobs in which overtime is mandatory. So this has to do with the idea of compensating differentials. But that is really all that I can say about this problem. It's just conceptual. So moving on to the next one, working from home. The U.S. government passed a law in 1942 that prohibited garment makers from employing independent contractors working out of their homes. The reason was that those working at home made less money and policymakers believed they were being exploited. Comment on the assertion that the difference in pay between workers and home workers doing the same tasks constitutes a measure of exploitation. So the answer given is that lower wages for people working from home may not constitute exploitation if workers are willing to accept lower wages in exchange for any compensating differentials, things like risk, fringe benefits, job location, etc. So again, if those workers are willing to accept that lower pay, it can't be argued as exploitation. Because, or again, revolving around the idea of compensating differentials. So that's actually all for today, just those 3 short problems. Nothing too difficult from what we've done so far this semester, but that's really all I have for you today. So hopefully this was helpful, and I will see you next week, and good luck with your studying.